The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not have even a chance to eat. He said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran so fast from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them. When they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," he said, "and it is very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fishes. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up onto a mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the 4th watch of the night, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, for it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all that touched him were healed.
When we picture the work of a shepherd, I wonder what springs to mind. I guess kind of a man out on a wild hillside with a lovely flock of gleaming white sheep dotted around him. What are the various jobs of a shepherd? That's to protect, protect the sheep. That was particularly the case when sheep roamed a lot more wild than they tend to in this country today, protecting them from sheep and bears and things we hear of David doing in the Old Testament. Part of his job is to build the sheep into a single unit, into a flock. You can't have sheep wandering off. If they do, then Jesus ends up telling a parable about you leaving the 99 to all get lost while you go off and try and save the one. The shepherd's job is to feed the sheep. Still as true today as it ever was. We've seen the pictures on the news recently of sheep farmers trying hard to feed their sheep when there's been very little water and there's no grass there for them to eat. Providing good pasture and water is an important role. What's generally to take care of, to look after the sheep. And in the Bible, that term shepherd is very often used to describe the act of providing all of that kind of care and provision and leading and protection, not necessarily to sheep, but to God's people. In Ezekiel chapter 34, God chastises those who he had appointed to be shepherds over his nation. And he promises that he will come and take responsibility to directly shepherd the people himself. But this is what the sovereign Lord says: I am against the shepherd and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says: I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they are scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, and in the ravines and in the settlements in the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and make them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. As God denounces those who had not been looking after his people properly, saying they've been bad shepherds for the people, he says, I'm going to come. I myself, God, is going to come and shepherd the people himself. He's going to be there with them on the mountains of Israel. He is going to provide food and teaching and nurturing and pasture for his people. He promises that he's going to come and he's going to make life better for those who belong to him. And in Mark chapter 6, in this passage that Elaine read for us, we see Jesus fulfilling the role of the great shepherd. We see him being that person for the people of Israel who crowded round him, but particularly being a great shepherd to the 12 appointed apostles. To understand what was going on in verse 30, we need to remember what had happened in verses 7 to 13, because that's where this carries straight on from. We had the interlude in between where we looked at Herod and John the Baptist. But actually these events follow right on from verses 7 to 13. And there Jesus gave the apostles power and authority to perform miracles. They went and they drove out demons. They healed the sick. Verse 30, they come back to Jesus like excited children arriving home from the most amazing school trip. They just want to talk. They want to talk about it. They want to tell you everything that has been going on. Jesus listens patiently. Even though he already knew everything that had happened. But he listened. He knew they needed to talk about this. They were so excited. But he also knew that now it was time for them to rest. It had been hard work. Their emotions had been all over the place. Let's get away and rest. And Jesus knew that exactly the thing that was going to help provide that rest. If they were going to continue learning and progressing, they needed a little bit of downtime. So he took them out on an activity that these people, remember their background, he took them on an activity that they could do without stress and without worry that was just home to them. He took them out on a boat on a nice little crossing of Galilee on the waters that they knew so well. Yes, I know that he was aiming for that quiet place over there, but even the journey itself, the way he chose to get there, this was downtime for these seasoned fishermen who could relax on the boat out on Galilee. Jesus says to us, he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." He added, "My yoke is easy and my burden light." We sang earlier about our chains falling off when we turn to Jesus. Chains are to do with slavery. Chains are to do with being bound to something. Jesus came to set us free from that. He came to give us that freedom. Not to wear us out. Not to place a heavy yoke on us. But to share the load. To walk with us. He never wanted to overburden his disciples. When the work had been hard, he wanted to give them that time of rest. Jesus never wants to overburden us. Yes, there's so much that he wants to do. There's so much that he wants us to work with him as. But he doesn't want to overburden us. He wants to grant us that peace. His aim is to nurture. His aim is to guide. His aim is to protect. He is the great shepherd that God had promised to be. So imagine the looks on the faces of the disciples as they brought their boat ashore in this remote location, thinking, great, now we're going to get this time of rest, just us and Jesus and everybody else can just leave us alone for a little while. Imagine their faces when they looked out on the shore and saw hundreds, thousands of people gathered. Imagine their hearts dropping. Oh, no. This was meant to be a rest. This was meant to be a break. Look at them all. What are we going to do? When it started to get a little bit later in the day and the people showed no sign of wanting to go home, it's maybe no surprise that they suggest, purely out of concern for the crowds, obviously, Jesus could send the crowds home. We don't want them getting overly hungry. We don't want them getting dizzy and falling over on the way home, do we? Maybe now's the time to let them move on. Jesus had a different agenda. Where the disciples saw an intrusion on their time, Jesus saw people in need. And he set out to meet that need. The disciples were, in what they said, they were right. They really were miles away from anywhere. It would have cost a small fortune to get enough bread for all the people who were turned up. But they were forgetting the lessons that they'd been learning on their missionary trip. They were forgetting all those miracles that they'd already seen Jesus perform. Perhaps most of all, they were forgetting to follow Jesus' example of compassion and grace on the lost and the vulnerable. Remember what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, about following Jesus' example. The role of every Christian is to be more and more like Jesus. The disciples were watching and following Jesus. They were meant to be becoming more and more like him. And that meant his compassion and his mercy on others as well. And in this moment, they temporarily forgot that. So here in this remote place, Jesus turned a small amount of bread, these were just little loaves, into a feast for at least 5,000 people, probably many more if we add in the women and the children who were there as well. And Jesus was doing exactly what God the Father had always done. Jesus wasn't doing anything new here. When the people of Israel crossed the wilderness with Moses leading them, God saw that the people were hungry and harassed, and he gave them bread from nothing. He created bread out of zero and laid it all out on the ground for them. Those of you who've been following our daily readings, this last week you'd have read how God made a few small bread rolls feed 100 people with loads and loads left over. They had more left over at the end than they began with at the start. And now in verse 34, Jesus saw the people were like sheep without a shepherd. They were vulnerable. They were in a remote place. And he gave them bread, as God had always done. He was being the shepherd that God had promised to be in Ezekiel 34. He was pasturing the people of God in a remote place exactly as he'd said he would in Ezekiel 34. But he was being a shepherd in a different way as well. He was teaching. He was teaching his disciples. See, Jesus could have done this miracle without any help whatsoever. Now, don't forget what God did in that wilderness. He created bread out of nothing. The people woke up every morning and there it all was, all laid out across the floor. Jesus could have just done this. Jesus could have just created bread and fed all the people on his own. But he says, no, disciples, I want you to get involved. I want you to be part of this. Go and organise the people. Get them to sit down in groups. Then he gave the bread to them. Just five loaves and 2 fishes. He said to them, here you are. Here it is. Go and feed all those thousands of people. If this hadn't worked, how do you think the disciples would have looked in front of those people? They were in danger of looking very, very silly here, trying to feed thousands and thousands of people. You know, we read in the other Gospels, this was basically one boy's packed lunch that he'd taken for himself that was now being shared out among all of these people. See, where there's no risk, there's no faith. The disciples had to put their faith in Jesus and say, we are going to be prepared to look foolish if this doesn't work. We trust that this is absolutely going to work. They took the risk. Their faith proved to be well-founded. And they took part in this miracle that is still spoken of today. It's one of those miracles that's just sort of earned its way into the English language, isn't it? When we talk about a lot of people coming to dinner or something, we talk about, oh, we're feeding the 5,000. It's one of those things everybody knows about. These disciples, they were part of it. They were there at the original. They didn't just witness it, they took part, they helped. What a privilege it was for those disciples to be part of this amazing miracle. that people still speak of 2,000 years later. And what a shepherd Jesus was being. He was teaching his followers by letting them get involved. You know, we have these days, we have what's called a modern apprenticeship, and it involves an awful lot of sort of classroom type work. And it's not quite like the old idea of an apprenticeship, where an apprentice would work with a master craftsman. And yes, an apprentice would be sweeping the floor and making the tea a lot of the time. But they were watching the master craftsman at work. They were watching how that craftsman looked after the tools. How that craftsman took time to make sure that he did everything correctly. They were learning as they watched the master. And when that master tradesman started letting the apprentice help him, they were growing and learning and watching. They were being shepherded in their trade. Jesus was doing this 2,000 years ago. He said to the disciples, this is how it's done. This is how you have compassion. This is how you trust God. And he got them involved. He let them be part of it. You know what? This is going to be breaking news, and it might worry some of you, and you think, oh no, okay, I'm going to walk away then. But I'm going to tell you now, Jesus does not need us to do a holiday club to save children on this estate. Oh dear, don't resign. Stay with me. He doesn't need to use you to share the gospel with your family. If Jesus wants to save people on this estate, if he wants to save children, he can do that without us. If he wants to bring people in your family to a saving faith, he can meet them face to face as he did with the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus. But God has chosen to work in a different way. He's decided, I'm not going to go and meet people like that. I'm not going to go and meet people like I did with the Apostle Paul. No, I am going to work through you. I am going to choose to use you as part of my salvation plan. I want you to come and be close and work with me so that we get to know each other. You get to see what it's like to be part of this. You start to develop a heart that reflects my heart. You start to reflect my desires, my wish for the people on this estate. And he gives us that massive, massive privilege of being part in the greatest miracle in the world, which is seeing somebody come to faith. That is a greater miracle than feeding 5,000 people on a hillside. Our little grandson, he likes to help his nanny in the garden. He goes out with his little spade and he digs some random holes anywhere, it doesn't really matter where. He gets the watering can and he drags it across the garden, sprays some water somewhere. He says, that's it, I've helped. I've done that, I've done my bit. Mandy could do the job a lot quicker and a lot easier without that kind of help. But she lets him. She loves him to go and help her in the garden. Because as they're doing that, their relationship is growing. He's loving being with his nanny. His nanny is loving having him there. They're getting to know one another. That is how God sees us. If God wanted to save people, he could do it in that blinding flash of light. He could do it a lot easier than having to mess around with us, who sit there at home saying, no, I can't do it and I don't know what to say and I've got all these problems. And we just make it twice as difficult for God to save people. But he says, I want you to. I want to work through you. I want to give you that privilege. And I want us to grow in our relationship with each other as we work together to bring people to salvation. One day Eli is going to discover that there's more exciting things to do than digging random holes in our back garden. And Mandy is going to be saddened that those days have gone. Let's not be like that with our Heavenly Father. with our great shepherd. Let's stay close to him. Let's keep working with him. Keep being part of his plan to save people. Let our relationship with him grow and build. Another role of the shepherd is to build confidence. Sheep have got to learn that they're safe if they stay close to the shepherd. Sheep have got to learn that if they start wandering off away from the shepherd, that's dangerous. They get picked off by wolves and whatever else is out there. In this passage, as we move on from the feeding of the 5,000 to the walking on the water, Jesus was building the confidence of his disciples. He was shepherding them. He was showing them who he really was. His concern for their downtime and their relaxation hadn't really disappeared when the crowds arrived. He sent them on ahead of him for a little night sail. Go and relax on the water. It's lovely out there. While he remained to pray. Then he did another one of those incredible miracles that everybody remembers. We talk about the feeding of the 5,000. We talk about walking on water, don't we? It's really not true that Jesus came from Grimsby. The reason people think that Jesus might have come from Grimsby is if you look at the Humber with all the chemicals that are in it, you can actually walk across the water there. It's almost solid with all the rubbish that's in it. But Jesus walked on a real lake with real water, and it was genuinely a miracle. When they saw him, verse 50 says they were terrified. Look at what it goes on to say after verse 50. It says, immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. They were completely amazed. Wouldn't you be if you saw somebody walking across the water towards you? Not surprising they were amazed. For they had not understood about the loaves, their hearts were hardened. What is it they hadn't understood? In what ways were their hearts hardened? In the Bible, having a hard heart isn't a lack of compassion, which is how we tend to use the word today. Having a hard heart in the Bible means being resistant to God's plans, resistant to what God is trying to teach us. What have you brought for me? You're always bringing me things, aren't you? No, you're not going to let me have it. I'll sulk with you then. I know. Come back to Mummy. Oh, right, this is going to be a fun sermon from here. You're going to stay... go on, back to Mummy. In the Bible, I'm just wondering what it's going to sound like on the tape when we put this online. That's going to be brilliant. People are going to be sitting at home trying to picture what is going on there. And do you know what? We're not going to tell them. Look, hard heart in the Bible is being resistant to the message and the lessons of God. They weren't comprehending God's plans because they hadn't fully understood the lesson of the loaves. They hadn't fully understood that as Jesus was feeding all those people out on that barren area, that Jesus was fulfilling all the promises that God made in Ezekiel 34. Because that miracle, the nature of the miracle, proved that Jesus was God who gave manna to the Israelites. Jesus was being God who promised to be that shepherd pasturing them on the mountainside. What they had seen should have given them confidence that Jesus truly, completely, definitely was God. And that their lives were safe in his good hands. They were shocked that Jesus could walk on water. Of course Jesus could walk on water. He made the water. Job had said that he treads on the waves of the sea. Jesus is God. Of course he could tread on the waves of the sea. There was nothing for them to be afraid of. This was just God being God and doing what God does. We've been part of a far greater miracle even than of feeding the 5,000 or walking on water. Jesus, who is God in human form, gave himself to die on a cross to pay for our sin. Even though we'd lived in denial and rebellion, God chose to give us the faith to believe, the faith to repent and find salvation and become children of God. That is a far greater miracle than the feeding of the 5,000. Just as the feeding of the 5,000 should have given the disciples faith in God, so what God has done for us can give us faith in God. Faith to listen to him as our shepherd. Faith to go where he leads us and not to concern ourselves with the dangers. Faith to trust in his provision. He's the great shepherd who can create bread from nothing. He will always ensure that we have everything that we need. Let it encourage us to trust his teaching above anything that the world might try to teach us. Let it encourage us to stay close to him. Don't wander off. Stay close. He's the good shepherd. He's God who will protect us and lead us and guide us. He is truly the great shepherd in our lives.